We're actually going to start off not with Andrew's work, but with the work of a colleague and the passing of Seamus Heaney. Now, the London Review website has just put up a link to Andrew's 2011 story of travelling, both with Heaney and the late London Review of Books editor Carl Miller. And I'm just going to read a very, very short passage from that, and then I'm going to throw to you to talk about Seamus. In the main room of Yeats Tower at Ballylee, with the shallow stream below and the light coming in from the green-framed window, I looked at Seamus and Carl, and suddenly I had a vision of a time when they would no longer be alive, and a time when none of us would be alive. At the top of the tower, the sheer green of the trees gave out to other greens, and the sense of peace up there was unforgettable. Now, last night, that actually made me cry. It's reading so differently now, and I just want to get your thoughts. I know you've been up all night writing about Seamus.
Well, it was a immeasurable loss. Seamus Heaney, I think, was the great, not only the greatest Irish poet since Yeats, but I think the great representative late 20th century poet in English, that he gave us a notion of humanity and tolerance, a notion of seeing the world's arguments from both sides, of learning to understand hatred in the eyes of your enemy and transforming it into something much more like coexistence. For that reason, for that long dedication to human compatibility, he won the Nobel Prize. And one of the great and most fortunate things that happened to me in my career so far is that I ended up with Seamus on my side. It's not always a natural thing for writers to be on each other's sides, as I'm sure you've observed in your careers as readers. But Seamus was somebody who came into my life in my 20s. Mm-hmm. We became friends. And some people have an absolute native gift for making you better than you are. And I would describe that as the ultimate definition of friendship. Someone who can enlarge you every time you encounter them, as well as every time you encounter their work. And of course, it's enormously rare to have that level of commitment and that talent that can transform your sense of what your potential is. I think sometimes your friends, they're not just people who echo back to you what you want to hear about yourself, but they hold the key to your potential. And having the right friends is almost as important as having the right relationship of any other sort in your life. But anyway, I know we're not going to be able to talk about Seamus all night, although I happily could. You haven't come for that, and it wouldn't be fair. But I would like to read one poem in tribute, one of his poems, if you don't mind. It seems that, given that this is an international writers' festival and Seamus has died in the middle of it, that we should take this couple of minutes to read what, for me, is one of the great Heaney poems, somehow guiding us towards a sort of spiritual understanding of the troubles that he lived through, of the divisions that exist between human beings, and somehow allowing the possibility that they can be improved upon. This is called Two Lorries. It's raining on black coal and warm, wet ashes. There are tire marks in the yard. Agnew's old lorry has all its cribs down. And Agnew, the coalman, with his Belfast accent, sweet-talking my mother. Would she ever go to a film in Macrofelt? But it's raining, and he still has half the load to deliver further on. This time, the load our coal came from was silk black, so the ashes will be the silkiest white. The Marrowfelt via Toombridge bus goes by. The half-stripped lorry with its emptied, folded coal bags moves my mother the tasty ways of a leather-aproned coalman. And films no less, the conceit of a coalman. She goes back in and gets out the black lead and emery paper This 1940s mother, all business round her stove, half wiping ashes with a backhand from her cheek as the bolted lorry gets revved and turned and heads for Marafelt and the last delivery. Oh, Marafelt. Oh, dream of red plush and a city coalman. As time fast forwards and a different lorry groans into shot up Broad Street with a payload that will blow the bus station to dust and ashes. After that happened, I had a vision of my mother, a revenant on the bench where I would meet her in that cold, floored waiting room in Marafelt, her shopping bags full up with shoveled ashes. Death walked out past her like a dust-faced coalman, refolding body bags, plying his load, empty upon empty, in a flurry of motes and engine revs. But which lorry was it now? Young Agnew's or that other, heavier, deadlier one, set to explode in a time beyond her time in Marafelt? So tally bags and sweet talk darkness, coal man. Listen to the rain spit in new ashes. As you heft a load of dust that was Marafelt, then reappear from your lorry as my mother's dreamboat Coleman filmed in silk white ashes. Thank you.
I want to go back to when you were 21 now, and when you started at London Review of Books. And you've told this story before, but I do want to explore it. I think it's a keynote in your work. Tell us about that first essay that you wrote.
Oh, yes. This was, 1993. In March 93, suddenly some pictures come onto our screens of describing a terrible murder of a 3-year-old boy in Liverpool called James Bulger by 2 10-year-old boys. The images that came up were new to our eyes because they showed the moment when the boy had been abducted, you'll remember, many of you, and been abducted from the Strand shopping centre in Liverpool. Watching those images, almost like throwing a switch inside a writer. I mean, I was relatively young and wasn't sure when I'd begin. In some ways, I had begun to write in journals and my notes were growing in size, but this threw a switch in me and I realized there was something about the way that the case was being covered that wasn't right. Mm-hmm. And what wasn't right was that the 2 boys were being subject to the full sort of agony of not only an adult trial, but of adult vengefulness. That no matter how terrible the act, and of course it's hard to imagine an act more terrible, the authorities and the police and the public and the media, especially the media, were creating 3 victims where there was already 1. That seemed so clear to me, that by torturing the boys and then subjecting them to this hate campaign before and during the trial, they were somehow failing to exercise any understanding or compassion about what might have led those 2 10-year-old children to commit this act. So what I did was I searched inside. I think that what we've just heard is an example. They were the exemplars growing up of, it wasn't just journalism and essayists, but I looked to poets and novelists who would sometimes, in order to clarify something outside, they would travel inside, make an inward journey. That's what you do as a writer so often. And that inward journey led to me to a confessional essay about my own childhood. My childhood was full of the kind of childish violence that didn't lead to murder, but in essence it had the same irresponsible, amoral grounding. And it was the same kind of community. I grew up in a housing estate outside Glasgow, much like the housing estate those boys grew up in. And so I tried to make an argument about how the innocence of children was a kind of myth, that often children had nastiness in them. and that if you like, the growing beyond that nastiness was almost the definition of what adulthood was for us. But as children, we were surrounded by crazy, almost feral kids on those housing estates who were constantly harming each other. And so I tried to write about that personally, and it caused a complete furore because people, in a sense, weren't ready to hear that. What they wanted to hear, that these boys were completely exceptional and they should be banged up for life and threw away the key, and never try and investigate or understand why they did that, because it was too horrific and too frightening. So it was the beginning of a writing career where I felt that sometimes a writer's job is about defying the simplicities being presented in the media and going for something deeper, even if it's painful and exposing, which it sometimes is.
And that grew into your first book, The Missing, which took another tabloid monster.
Yeah.
Which is the case of the Fred and Rosemary West and the bodies being found in their backyard, if you all remember that one as well.
What was so astonishing about that, Michelle, was that there was, and I'm sure that you remember this case too, that every day more bodies kept being found in the garden of this house in Gloucestershire. And then eventually we knew that there had been 13 women buried under there. But again, the press weren't asking the single most important question, which was, why is it that 9 of those women who were buried there had never been reported as missing? Why? In a civil society with a National Health Service, we're supposed to have, some sense of a society, a community, a welfare state. Welfare state. Britain had become a place of the missing, a place where it was easy for women, especially women, to disappear, to become victims. Somehow the potential for victimhood had become much bigger than we ever believed it would in the post-war accord. And I saw that wasn't being picked up by the papers either. It was almost that they thought, these women have been missing for 20 years and nobody reported them missing. Well, that's because they were kind of loose women. And that seemed there was a kind of pornography and violent misogyny at work in the papers, actually, which you see quite a lot. There was no great shock in that. Yeah. But it seemed amazing to me that people wouldn't ask that their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their boyfriends, their doctors, their teachers, none of them noticed that they had disappeared. 9 of them. So that became the basis for a long, again, quite personal investigation.
Because you brought your own family into that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I saw that the reason I was interested in it, you don't come to things as an accident, by accident as a writer, I mean, people think, I'm always saying to students, when I have students, they say, how do I choose a subject? And I always want to say, it's very hard to swallow this as a truth, but a subject chooses you in some way. Of course, you need to elect to follow through, but if you really listen to the society you're living in and listen to yourself and listen to your own experience, then you'll find that a subject is choosing you. I don't think I've ever sat down in my career so far. I'm 45 years old. I've been writing since I was 21. I don't think I've ever chosen a subject out of thin air and just thought, oh, I'll have that. It's always come from some compulsion. There's a relationship. It's like falling in love, Falling in love is often a matter of recognition, not choice. You don't choose the person. You recognize that they are the person. You know what I mean?
So you've never, in all your time at the London Review of Books, just been assigned something you'd never thought about before?
They come up with ideas, but I tend not to say yes to the ideas which have nothing to do with me.
You wait until you recognise.
Yeah, good editors start to know your DNA. They can see it coming, and they'll say, how about, and they kind of gently, they also a very, very good editor, such as, I must say, the editor of the London Review of Books has a kind of sixth sense. She can tell before the train comes around the corner that it's got your name on it. And she just starts pushing you onto the platform, ready for its arrival.
Even before you know it.
Yeah. She knows that you're going to begin to find that interesting, and she'll sort of push you. William Shawn, the famous editor at the New Yorker, did exactly the same. Like Truman Capote, when he was wondering what to do next, he came in with 2 ideas. One was about cleaners in Fifth Avenue cleaning shops. And we wondered if he should hang around with these women for a few weeks and write about what it was like to be a cleaner in Fifth Avenue. And the other one was a little cutting from the New York Times about the murder of the Clutter family. And of course, the murder of the Clutter family became In Cold Blood, perhaps the great classic non-fiction account of the American century. William Shawn had already prepared the way and was saying, no, we've got you flight tickets. It's all happening. Let's leave those nice ladies alone in Fifth Avenue to go on with their dusting while you go to investigate this terrible crime.
Who knows what magnificent story about the life of cleaners we've lost forever.
I was thinking once of stealing it from my mum. There's a cleaner, you see. So I've got a big interest in cleaners. So I was thinking that since Truman Capote picked the wrong subject, I might pick it up. I have a feeling it won't sort of sweep the boards, though, like In Cold Blood, my book about cleaning ladies.
Well, I'm going to bring it to last year and a piece you did, which did indeed sweep the boards, or at least the social media boards, now that that interface with the London Review of Books is a lot more porous than it used to be. And that's your essay, Light Entertainment. Has anyone here read it? Could you raise hands? Okay, a few of you, but there'll need to be some context. This was an essay written in the teeth of another tabloid hysteria, which was the discovery of the extent of the abuse perpetrated by Jimmy Savile, the child abuse. And Andrew O'Hagan here wrote what's really a very fine piece of reportage, and I think we might double back to talk about where something is an essay and where something's reportage. I don't know. But he did an investigation into the BBC and explored the quite shocking revelations that we weren't talking about a one-off deviant, but we're talking about a culture in which that had attracted people who had exploited the younger members and the younger people who came through the BBC, and it named other people who had left damaged people in their wake. But yet it was quite nuanced. It could have been another horrific sort of sucker punch headline, and it wasn't. Were you surprised by what you found?
I'm always quite surprised when I find that much detail, because I'm a kind of detail junkie. I sort of get into a frame of mind where I'm just digging and digging and digging and talking to people. And then I was talking to one person who suddenly said, who'd worked at the BBC in the 1950s and 40s, actually, really elderly gentleman, and he said, well, of course, do you remember Uncle Mac? Uncle Mac was a famous figure, long before I was born, but for my mother's generation, Uncle Mac was the voice of childhood. Good night, children everywhere, was his catchphrase. And he was the voice of a kind of patrician child entertainer. Mm-hmm. This person I was interviewing said, Uncle Mac was the worst of them all. And I said, I want chapter and verse, I want names, I want chapter and verse. And I then pursued it and discovered that there had been an entire generation who'd covered up. Uncle Mac the prize for some of the children was that they got to come into the studio and meet Uncle Mac. So I then found people who had met Uncle Mac. And so this was in the 40s, and he had an assistant called Lionel Gamlin who ran a show called Top of the Form, which was about schoolboys, and mainly schoolboys, but also schoolgirls, public schoolboys in England in a kind of university challenge type program. He too had a massive paedophile relationship with generations of boys on that show. And once I began to find that out, I realised that actually it was a culture, as you say, it was a milieu at the BBC, and that when you began to look at the history of light entertainment in Britain, what you saw was that the public had colluded in this. We all knew, by the way, growing up, that Jimmy Savile was a problem. Everybody knew it. Because, in a sense, his talent, such as it was, depended on a certain kind of deviancy that he had. And that was true of so many light entertainers, that they were employed because they had a certain kind of ambisexual strangeness that appealed to the people making those programs, and the public liked it. You know, we pretended for years that John Inman on Are You Being Served was straight, or that Larry Grayson was straight. Now, I don't want to create a bogus relationship between being gay and being an abuser of children. That would be wrong. But I'm just giving you an indication that on every level of sexuality, we didn't face the truth. It was a kind of immature culture when it came to sexuality, and to some extent it still is. It's only in the last few years that we've begun to say, gay presenter dum-de-dum, his name or her name. You know, it was always imagined that the public just wouldn't notice, you know, that a man dressed in drag presenting a talent show, you know, might be gay, and that one of them, namely Jimmy Savile, who presented a show called Jim'll Fix It, where he dandled children on his knee, kissed them, you know, stroked them, encouraged them to have their dreams fulfilled, and then routinely encouraged them back to his dressing room for 30 or 40 years. He was knighted. He was given the keys to Broadmoor Prison as a sponsor. He was invited to dinners at Downing Street by Margaret Thatcher. There was a desperate head in the sand-ism about all this. And so I just tried to write an essay that opened it up and tried to tell the truth. You know, and
how do you write something like that and not strike the same tone as the tabloid reporting of it when the details themselves are so scarlet?
I think one of the things that I was lucky to have from the beginning is that I don't actually have a judgmental tone. I mean, I accept the world, and part of the world is that there are bad things in it, but they should be described and they should be exposed. But I don't want to expose them with a whole lot of editorial, but what should now happen to the perpetrator. That's not for me. That's for society and it's for the judicial system. But as a writer, I'm always interested in going into situations and just trying to give the context. I think the reason that BBC piece became so well known, and I mean, it went viral on the net in some way that completely surprised me, and it's sort of, the London Review's website crashed because 1.5 million people tried to read it in one day. That's an amazing new development, by the way. The London Review only sells 60,000 copies. But we've got this new thing called the internet, you know? And so when the piece goes up on the web, often people who have never heard of the London Review of Books are reading it and they're passing on, Facebooking it, tweeting it to their friends and everybody. And, you know, big television personalities started tweeting this as well. So it was going to millions of people. Anyway, that was a surprise, but the point was that it was because I provided a context for it. It wasn't really the revelations themselves, because not everybody remembers who Uncle Mac is or Lionel Gamlin or those people. It wasn't tabloidy in the sense that it was exposing people.
Revealed.
The allegations against people like Rolf Harris, etc., that's tabloid news because it's very live. I know that these are allegations at the moment, and I don't have much to say about that, but I try to provide a context which I always try and do in my writing, which is about the context of our lives. That's why the piece is 10,000 words long, not 600 words of screaming headline, because you try and get the subtlety of actual lived experience into it, so that when you read it, you think, oh my God, I feel I'm in that corridor. I feel I know that institution. I feel I know the times they're living through, the drinks they're drinking, what it's like in the pubs, when those young female presenters are being harassed. Joan Bakewell, the presenter, gave me a lot of material on and off the record about what it was like being a young female presenter in television journalism in the 1960s. You know, trying to take the reader into the room, that's where the novelist comes in. There's never been a great gulf for me between the person who writes a long piece of reportage or an essay and the person who writes the novels. To me, it's all writing, and your job is to provide the reader with the equipment to fully imagine it, morally and physically. Your job is to give them the arithmetic, and then you do the sum. I don't want to do the sum. I think the difference in tabloids is they shout the answer at you.
Yeah.
You know, whereas you guys are intelligent enough to do the sum yourself. And it's more satisfying for you that I retreat from the page and leave you to do the math.
I think too, the context you provided, which in some ways is so particular about the BBC and the 1950s and 60s, for Australians right now to reread the context you put around the mechanisms of light entertainment is feeling acute all over again, because there are 2 prominent Australian entertainers currently under trial in 2 countries.
It's really disturbing this, because
which means that it's a cultural issue for Australia
it's
as
a massive issue. I mean, those of us who feel that it's a generational thing, but for my generation, you really feel that your whole childhood is being blistered with bad news. Because if you're of my generation, then television was crucial to your sense of growth. You grew up with these people. These presenters taught us how to read, how to sing, how to paint. Didn't teach me how to sing very well, but you know, they were in our lives at the basic level of growth, nourishment, friendship. I felt Rolf Harris was my friend when I was a kid. Yeah. I mean, I know about the didgeridoo and those being that way of going on because of him, and that wobble ball. Everything he did, that was my childhood. We used to turn the tail, rush to see this guy. And not just him. When you look at the whole Jimmy Savile, there's now 6 or 7 names. Stuart Hall, who presented It's a Knockout, now in prison. There's a whole generation's worth of light entertainers who were our lives and were our childhoods. So I used to look at my 70s childhood with a kind of sense of sunshine. Scotland in the 70s, the great hot summer of 76, running around in your trunks with bottles of fairy liquid that weren't quite emptied out, full of water, squeezing it into your friend's eyes. That was
a hot summer in Scotland?
Yeah, it was amazing.
25, 26, 27.
It was actually properly boiling. 1976. It was the year the Sex Pistols came out. I'll never forget it, because we're all running about. At the start of that summer, we were all just sort of Scottish and pale and sort of sad and thinking, well, life is shite, actually. And by the end of the summer, we were brown, and we were like trying to put safety pins through our nose, and sort of, the whole of the universe opened up all in one summer, and we were really brown. Everybody had a tan. It was amazing. In Scotland in 1976, I've always wanted to want a book about that summer called That Summer, and people who remember that, because it was never hot in Scotland, as you imply. I mean, it was just, you just went from one rain shower to another. You spent your whole time in a cagoule. And we used to get these they were called snorkels. And it was a parka and it had fur around the hood. And when you zipped it up, it was like, the funnel in a ship.
Yeah.
And so you'd zip it up, but you had to keep zipping it all the way up to there. So your little face would be kind of half a mile back. So crossing the road was incredibly hard. You'd be like, it would take about 10 minutes to get all the way around, at which point a bus was coming. So the deaths of children in Scotland in the 1970s was ferociously high, I imagine. But we did throw off the snorkel, like a sort of, with a sense of, in the old sense, gay abandon, or maybe not in the old sense, we were sort of up for anything and running around getting tans. But the 70s our memory of the 70s was that it was a sort of period of sort of innocence. And it was our glory period, as children. But now I think of it, as I say, as something blistered, tarnished, muddied, made slightly polluted by the notion that all these highly paid public functionaries on television were, so many of them, actually abusing children. It's a horrific thought.
Well, you'd already been exploring, or popping, to use a horrible metaphor that I now immediately regret, those blisters in your 2003 novel Personality, which took a Scottish national hero, Lena Zavaroni, and told her story, which I don't think she'll be known particularly well.
There was a young girl, she was young at the time, obviously. She was 10 years old. She was called Lena Zavaroni. She came from a Scottish-Italian family and lived in the Isle of Bute, which is one of the closest of those islands just off the west coast of Scotland. Very near to where I grew up. I grew up on the west coast, looking into the sea and all that. Mm-hmm. She won a show called Opportunity Knocks, which was the X Factor of its day. Very low key when you look at X Factor. I mean, the people who won. I remember the guy who was most famous on that show for winning, he won it about 4 times in a row, was a guy called Tony Holland, who used to do a kind of he was a muscle guy, and he used to sort of make his tummy ripple to the music. The music was do 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 do, and we'd watch this mesmerised. Me and my 3 brothers, you know, and we used to do it around the living room, you know, sort of in trunks, you know, do do do, you know. But he was the most. So that's the size of the talent that you had on that show. But then. You know, and if you won it, you got like a sort of a booking at Blackpool for a season or half a season. I mean, it wasn't like now where, you know, you get to be ludicrously famous and move to Bel Air and get a Coke habit. You know, you just got to go to Blackpool and get an ice cream, and then you went back home to work in the factory, you know. But anyway, a girl won this called Lena Zavaroni, and she did have an absolutely amazing voice. She was like, you know, just couldn't believe this was coming out of this little girl. She won it 7 times in a row. It was presented by a completely terribly oily man called Hughie Green, this show, who, as I'm getting older and greyer myself, I should probably beware of saying things like this. The guy was probably only about 45 then, but he seemed like an old man to us. It was perfectly reasonable, except that he had he was almost a complete block of insincerity. He sort of smiled with only one half of his face. And it turns out that he was a sort of right-wing fascist of some description. I mean, it goes on and on, this light entertainment problem. But anyway, she started to starve herself, this girl. And the more famous she became, the more she inflicted pain on herself. We now know much more about anorexia nervosa and eating disorders than we did then in the 70s, but she eventually destroyed herself. She died in her 30s, desperate and alone in a flat in North London, having just basically been martyred by this new celebrity culture. Well, she was always, every photographer who came encouraged her to hold an ice cream cone and lick it because she was from the seaside, you know, and she just was repulsed by food. And the whole story got under my skin because we used to watch this program. There was something called the clapometer, which was on the screen. We were all quite stupid. And my father convinced us that the clapometer, which kind of went up like there was a needle on the television that went up when the audience in the studio clapped. So you would clap whatever act you thought was the best. But my father convinced us that if we clapped in our living room in Ayrshire, it would register in London. So we don't like clapping for Lena Zavaroni, this singer thing. So it's under my skin because of all that. You know, I said at the beginning, sometimes you get a personal connection to something and it just makes you feel that you know how to write about it. You just have an entry point which seems so personal to you. It's why people so often write about their families. You know, it's not because they've got nothing else to write about. It's because you feel that the DNA of your imagination meets a perfect protein. It just clicks. You just know how to write about your grandmother because you cared and you observed. So I really wanted to write about her, and I created a character influenced by her in that book. But it was an early attempt to try and deal with this celebrity culture madness.
And yet there's some uncanny connections with, I'm going to do a little bit of like prop holding. This is the current issue of London Review of Books, right here above the title. And this is a piece of reportage set in Kandahar, talking to children who failed in their first attempts as suicide bombers. And as he says, and I'm only going to be paraphrasing, their mothers say, "You'll be better at it next time." And there are some uncanny parallels between the children, you know, who want fame and the children who want paradise, and how they're both exploited.
There is. It's quite accidental in a way. I mean, at least at a conscious level, it's accidental. This is the strange thing about being a writer. You don't walk around thinking, this is the way my career is going to go. I'm going to have 40 years of doing this, and then, you know, hopefully it'll all work out. You just actually, you live spontaneously from piece to piece and from book to book. And it's only when I published that piece the other week, after being in Afghanistan, it was a desperate situation there. It was so threatening. We were under threat the whole time. We were in bulletproof cars. We kept getting thrown down because there was a suicide attack on the palace where we were there and all this. So it was threatening, but it was only when I came back and published the piece and saw that headline that I realised that I have actually written about the vulnerability of children a lot in my life. I've come back to it again and again in different forms. Now I was writing about child jihadis, having written about celebrities or people subject to the abuse of adults or subject to an vengeful press. I guess since for 20 years I've been interested in writing about children, and in between times I became an ambassador for UNICEF without ever making the connection. They asked me to help them raise funds and awareness, and I just went into it, but actually it's all been very natural to me at a subconscious level. I didn't have a very damaged childhood, I don't think. I mean, I do wish there were more summers like 1976. I don't think I can claim that as damage, the fact that it didn't happen. But I have always had this awareness that children are super vulnerable, and they became a kind of specialist subject. Those boys, I mean, the idea that your life, you've been so brainwashed, so taken out of the context of happiness and prosperity and optimism that you think that putting on a suicide vest, walking up to an American base security gate and flicking a switch on the vest and blowing yourself to smithereens is an option. Not only an option, but a desire. All those boys, when I first went in there, the child prison has a lot of children in there for stealing and for, violent activity and stealing things, so, as well as these jihadi children. When you give out pieces of paper and ask them all to write on the piece of paper why they're in prison, the thieves and the sort of violent ones and, the ones who won't go to school just crunch up the paper and throw it in the ground or spoil it or rip it up or whatever, shout and spoil it. But there's some very silent boys. And then they begin to write, and they write the most beautiful script. They're the jihadis. They're the educated ones. They're the ones who were taken to the best madrasas in Pakistan and taught about the Quran and about philosophy and about history, and then taught how to blow themselves up. If that's not a story of our times, I don't know what is. So when people say to me, why would you write a story like that? How could you not? If you had the means to get there and you had the typewriter and you had the imagination, you'd run to get there to tell that story. And I did. I didn't hesitate. Danger or no danger, somebody had to tell that story so that you, the reader, will understand next time you're watching a report, which will be tonight, about a suicide bomber attacks convoy, suicide bomber attacks school gates, It's not just a generic empty hole. It's that child. It's those people. You're able to put humanity back into the picture. And if I had to come up with one rubric for what a writer does, it's about helping you put humanity back in the picture. It's like Seamus's coal man, the memory of his mother, that it can suddenly be brought back to life. Language can do that.
And yet there's this other strand of stuff, and I imagine this is where you might more often be asked this question. On one hand, you have these extraordinary, intense, serious, questioning pieces, and you're also a fashion correspondent for the New York Times style section. You wrote a terrific interview with Miuccia Prada. Your latest novel is indeed narrated by Marilyn Monroe's dog and full of gossip.
I'm always
You've
trying to give myself a
fanboying,
reason
frankly,
to smile.
for Morrissey. You've been a film reviewer. Do you do that just as a change of pace, to bring out your light?
I do it so as to put a smile on my face, because if I did that other stuff all day, every day, I'm natively quite a good laugh. And I like being in the pub, getting drunk and talking shite to my friends all day and all night. So the idea that I don't know, I tripped into the wrong job somehow, and sometimes I have to remind myself that actually I'm a bit of an idiot who just likes a giggle. And so when the New York Times phones me and said, do you want to go to the Milan the Milan fashion show and sit in your ass watching pretty people walk up and down in frocks? I'm like that, that sounds fine. Just send me the ticket, because I also think more seriously that you've got to search for variety as a writer. You've got to open up the aperture all the time. I mean, I would like to think there's no story that I would absolutely categorically refuse to write. I mean, you don't want to do too much froth and too much frivolity, because I have got a sense that there are stories not being written that should be written, like that one, or, you know, the BBC thing. But I spend months on those. So I come out of the tunnel and there's somebody standing there from Vogue saying, Kate Moss really wants you to come and interview her. She read a thing you wrote and liked it. I'm like, that'll do fine. Just, you know.
But it must resonate with you a bit, though, even the fashion stuff.
But what I notice when I read the pieces back is that sort of, I never quite get them frothy enough. So every few paragraphs, I sort of dive into some sort of like rabbit hole of seriousness and I go down there. But the magazines like that, you know, they always want a bit of that. So, I mean, I liked your presentation of it, but I should say I'm not actually a fashion correspondent. I've just written a couple of fashion pieces for them because I don't really know enough. I would love to be a fashion correspondent, though, because when I went to interview Mrs. Prada, I mean, I had to practically crawl through the mud to get that Afghanistan piece. You know, there was like bullets and everything, and I'm like, fuck, you know, I need to sort of like get onto one of those sort of easier jobs one of these days. So going to see Mrs. Prada is about Mrs. Prada saying, "Hello, darling, let's have champagne." Literally. I'm like, of course. And I say, so what about those knickers? They look nice. And she said, yeah, they're fantastically revolutionary. I mean, I'm interested in women's relationship with ugliness. I'm like, fantastic, more champagne. Get it all down. I love it.
Ah. And your other strand is still the memoirist elements. Every now and then you tell your own story or another postcard from your own story again. How do you navigate that with the living family?
Oh, I got over that a long time ago. I once explained to my family, you know, Hogmanay, if you ever want to tell anybody in a Scottish family anything, wait till 5 to midnight on the 31st of December. You know, Hogmanay is a great time because you always get forgiven. And because everybody's so sentimental in Scotland at Hogmanay, you know, we all just cry. I don't know what we're crying about, by the way, but we really do cry.
Yeah.
My mother cries down the phone now because I live in London, and she phones me up crying, saying, well, that's the bells. I can hear them. Like, yeah, I know, well, that's another year. I know. I hope you get what you're looking for. Every year it's the same phrases. Now I say them to her. I hope you get what you're looking for. What are you looking for? Shut up. You know. But one year, there's a great thing that Evelyn Waugh said, that when there's a novelist born in the family, the family's finished. And I said to my mother, this nice quote from that Evelyn Waugh there on that pad I wrote down. And she went, oh, they don't half-talk some rubbish. And I said, oh, I don't think that went down that well. So I've just tried to, with every book and with every piece, especially when it's personal, just tried to explain to my mother that there is a difference between fiction and reality. So we have this drink, we go to the pub, and I say, well, Mum, I've got a new book coming out. And she always says the same thing. She says, is he in it? He. And I said, yes. Well, do you tell the truth about him? And I said, I try to. She said, well, that's fine then, let's have another drink. And that's it. We don't really have any difficulty. My brothers accept it. My brothers are great, actually. I brought my brother to Australia the last time on a book tour as a way of, you know, because he couldn't believe that you were an author. I came to the Perth Writers Festival and then went to 4 other cities. And they offered to fly me business class, but I thought that I'd bring my brother instead and we'd just go at the back of the bus, and that's what we did. So I took him around Australia and he couldn't believe it. So now he thinks that it's real, this thing. You can be a writer and like you go around and people send a car. It's amazing. He tells everybody. It's like, he can write what he likes. I don't care, because he took me to Australia. So I'm buying them all off, basically, is what I'm telling you. Slowly. My mother, it's just a drink. My brother, I had to take him around Australia. I'm working my way through.
There are 3, 4 brothers?
3, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I've got a bit of work to do there.
Yeah. I'm conscious of the time, and I know many of you will have really good questions. Do we have hands up? Is anyone game to ask a first question? There's actually a gentleman right down here who gets to be first.
Have you ever been troubled by lawyers or worried about your writing because of consequences?
Yes, quite often. What happens is that you get lawyers I mean, I just basically, I don't hide from the lawyers now. I just basically bring the lawyers in and say, and they're good lawyers. They're the sort of lawyers who find reasons for keeping things in, as opposed to the other sort, you know? So I've got good lawyers, and I say, right, tell me what is going to get me arrested in this case. And they'll just highlight it and say, you need another source for that, or you better make sure you're right about that before you call that guy a paedophile. So that was all really, really secured. I've never lost a court case, but I have been taken to court. The London Review made an error once about, and it was during apartheid, and we named the wrong minister as the one that was suppressing information about AIDS. We lost that case because we straightforwardly got his name wrong. But me personally, the only time it's got quite hair-raising was during the West trial with my first book, when I had found out more than the police in that particular case, about one particular aspect of the case, which was to do with the killer's first wife, who came from Glasgow. And my book wasn't about the whole murder case. It was about the relationship between us growing up and these people disappearing. And I had started to tell the story of the first wife in Glasgow and in a context that I knew about. And I'd actually found much more about her. So the police injuncted the book because they thought it would threaten. They thought it would threaten the trial that they were building against them. That it would suggest that, without being too technical about it, the two of them were up for murder. Fred West and his wife. The prosecution had to prove, once he killed himself, which he did in prison, and she was then on trial herself, they had to prove that she had murderous intent. My evidence suggested that he'd been killing before he met her, because he killed his first wife. And so that was why the prosecution were worried that my book, if not injuncted, would prejudice the case against her. So, but anyway, I called them in and I showed them the drafts and I showed them the evidence and I shared the material with them. So they were then able to bring it into their case, and they didn't injunct the book. The book was published, well, at that time, and it was fine. So sometimes, though, just to finish on that point, it's a really important point. Sometimes people feel that if you write about them, you have to ask their permission. And I'm afraid it's a really controversial but strange thing in life that I don't need your permission to write about you. It might be nice of me to ask you. It might be courteous. And if I lie about you, you can do me. But if I tell the truth about you, you personally, any of you, then that's a human right. You don't, in other words, you don't own the details of your own story. You think you do. You think you own your life story, but you don't. It belongs to the world. And as long as I don't libel you, I can tell that story. But a lot of the time, people come up and say, you didn't ask my permission before you told my story or my son's story. And I have to then say, I'm sorry, but you don't own that. We don't own. And if we did, it would be a kind of hellish world, because people who had reasons that you don't have to cover up their stories would use that. Powerful people, liars, exploiters would use that they own their story and it's private. That's why you need to always keep your eye on privacy law, because it always benefits the corrupt.
Anyone else?
Do you think you bring a Scottish sensibility to your writing? Because I've read you for a number of years without necessarily even picking up that you would sound Scottish.
Robert Louis Stevenson, of course, a very great Scottish novelist, but in America, where he was greatly successful, they often forgot that he was Scottish. But it seems to me that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde's a profoundly Scottish novel about being divided, about being in two minds. There's a whole literature in Scotland before that, which is about running with the hare and the hounds, wanting it both ways. It's a big thing in Scottish history as well, being both a nationalist and an internationalist, being, a West Coaster with some sympathy for the East, but you're not sure. If you're in Glasgow, do you like Edinburgh? If you support Celtic, do you like Rangers? It's a very divided society at every level, though it's such a small country. So what he said, Stevenson, was that he felt that a lot of the writers that he preferred had a strong Scots accent of the mind. And that's what I would argue for. I think when I look at my pieces, I see that there's an accent of the mind, which it comes from the kind of background and education I had. There's some very Scottish hardness in the pieces, but also it lives beside a very natural lightness of tone, which I've always lived with both. I like jokes, and I often don't write pieces, as I said, where jokes would come naturally. But if I can find a person or a character who sort of exhibits a part of life which is colourful or funny, I'll always try and bring them in. So I think there is Scottishness there. It would be hard for me to pinpoint it, though. But it's interesting to hear you say that you haven't noticed it.
With the high quality of print journalism in general seeming so precarious, how do you think the future of the LRB's high standards is looking?
Thank you. It's been a really interesting journey, because when I first came into this business, which wasn't 100 years ago, it feels quite recently to me, everybody spoke about dumbing down, that the whole bottom was falling out of the essay, that the essay was a dead form, that long-form reportage was dead, that the economics of it didn't work, that people weren't reading anymore, that kids had an attention span of 4.3 seconds, when we know fine well it's 4.7 seconds. No, there was all that. But during that period, from then till now, the LRB's circulation has gone from 14,000 to 65,000. And its web presence, of course, has become a phenomenon, a global phenomenon, that, in a sense, papers like The Guardian or the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books or other publications, the New Yorker, have in fact increased their share of world attention at a time when we're supposed to have no interest anymore in concentration. So I'm actually quite confident about the future of the essay. I've never felt more secure in my employment as I do now. Famous last words, I'll be fired by everybody next week. But I'll go down singing, because I think that that it's a nice moment. A lot of people seem to want to read proper writing. And by proper writing, I mean just where you spread your elbows a little bit and really try and look into the subject. And also try and do some good writing, make it come alive, make it be true, activate the mind of the reader, treat the reader with it as if they were indeed what they are, which is intelligent, searching, moral beings who want not just to have headlines shouting at them and prejudice thrown in their face by newspapers, but actually want to have their mind expanded. We're all in that game if we're any good or if we're serious. And I've seen that spike go up in my time. It's on an upward curve at the moment. And there are essay prizes. The William Hazlitt Essay Prize has just been founded in England, £15,000 prize money for. I mean, it's just becoming a much, much bigger thing in the culture. It's probably more healthy than it's been since the time of George Orwell, I would say, the essay. So it's good news, I think.
Andrew, you were talking before about someone not necessarily owning their own story. You were involved, tell me if I'm wrong, with the book about Julian Assange.
Yes.
And I was wondering what you learnt from that experience and if you came out of the process with a different view of him than when you went into it.
Well, I didn't come out with a very different opinion because it was actually such an intense period. What people should remember about Wikileaks and about Julian Assange particularly is that those people are working under incredible pressure in a situation where they're facing enormous, powerful organizations all over the world who have public relations departments, massive funding, marketing departments, strategy, buildings, fabric, money. And this organization is a tiny grouping of essentially moral agents who believe very much in opposing government corruption, surveillance, and lies. And so working with them was a pleasure to try and help them clarify their story. As it happened, relationships within that publishing venture collapsed beyond my control. My relationship with the organization never collapsed, and it's consistent up until this moment. I'm still interested in the work being done and feel that those people, and I don't just mean WikiLeaks here, I would extend it to the work that Edward Snowden's doing and being punished for by the American state at the moment, Private Manning the same, and other organizations which actually service democracy. If you believe in democracy, then you believe in its replenishment and its renovation, and that means people asking difficult questions and making exposures where there is secret, undemocratic surveillance and abuse of power. So I think I came out of it as convinced in the basic rightness. There are mistakes, there are disorganized elements, but the fundamental principle is that these people need to do this work in order for us to live in a more open society. I would just say furthermore to that, that we've never lived through a time before when people doing that sort of work are attacked to the extent they are by other journalists. This is what's rare in this situation. You can say what you like about the particular personalities involved and possible failings there. That you're free to do that, and so you should be. They should be questionable just as the organizations they're questioning should be questionable. But I have to say that Daniel Ellsberg, who was behind the Pentagon Papers, Seymour Hersh, who was behind exposing the My Lai massacre, Bob Woodward and Bernstein, who were behind Watergate, never had the opposition that WikiLeaks has endured from other journalists. Edward Snowden is being put through the ringer by journalists at the moment. People like Jeffrey Toobin in the New Yorker saying that he should be arrested, that a drone should be, another source said that a drone should be sent in over the Ecuadorian embassy in London to take Julian Assange out. He's an editor. He's a journalist. And it seems to me that we're living through very sorry times when the attempt to expose exploitation and skullduggery in government is meeting with opposition from professional journalists who don't recognize that effort as being admirable or legitimate. I find that strange. That's a new element, but I've gone beyond your question because I feel strongly about it, but I have to tell you that I came out of the process more emboldened on their behalf. I mean, it's not my work, it's not my area of expertise, but I enjoyed trying to help them clarify their message because it's a crucial message.
Are you at peace with the fact that the publisher released the raw draft?
Yes, it seems to me that the publisher and had their reasons, financial and otherwise, to do that. I mean, in a sense, it wasn't my call. The relationship was between Julian Assange and his publisher, negotiated by his agent. I had my own separate arrangements with all of them, and I've maintained my independence from that. I regretted that it ended the way that it did, because all those people concerned are idealistic, high-minded people, as it happens, and they just didn't get along sufficiently to complete that project.
Do you consider it one of your works?
No, it's not a book by me. It's an early draft of an attempt to clarify Julian's message. It's his book.
Do we have time for any more questions? Is there somebody able to shake their head or nod their head at me? That I think means no, which means that at this point we should just put our hands together and thank Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.